Hello, everybody. It's early in 2025, but as always, there's troubling news. Apparently, half of Americans read at sixth grade level or below. Very troubling number. The Financial Times asks whether we're becoming, quote unquote, a post literate society. Even AI, which may be the cause of a lot of that, acknowledges that most adult Americans can only understand text at a level similar to a middle school student, maybe more than a 10-year-old, but not much more. One person who's certainly more literate than the average American is my guest today, a very good old friend of mine, Chris Schroeder. He's been on the show many times before, and in his annual Substack summary of books read, he's read over 100 books. I think last year he read 150. It's quite an achievement, and he lists a lot of the best books he read in a Books Read 2024 Substack post. Chris, Happy New Year.
And to you, it's great to be with you as always, my friend.
So, Chris, do you agree with some of these dire prognostications on the level of American reading? Are we indeed, maybe not just America, but Western Europe, are we becoming a post-literate society? And is that something to be concerned with or to celebrate?
I think that, I don't have the data and everything else, and certainly I have experiences in a city like Washington or New York where you get very concerned about things in our schools. I must say, however, with the young people I meet, particularly entrepreneurs and folks who are really building things around the world, they're unbelievably literate, very curious. They read a great deal, maybe more blogs and other kinds of things. But I can't begin to tell you the feedback I get when I write up my books and everything else. It's often young people who are literally copying my list. And in fact, young people are often influencers on the books that I read this year. So we'll have to see. But obviously, if it is a trend, it is concerning. When you travel in Europe, by the way, I know you know this better than anyone. I mean, there's some countries where there are bookstores everywhere, and there are others where less so. So I don't know. We'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, you told me before we went live that you have a rule with yourself that you need to read 100 pages of a book before you watch TV or immerse yourself in social media. Why do you think reading social media or perhaps watching TV isn't of the same intellectually challenging caliber in terms of your investment of time of reading? What is it about reading that makes it different?
It all complements each other, as you know very well. I mean, look, at the end of the day, social media and media tends to be sound bites. It tends to be very, very quick. You can get updated on things that are breaking. You can certainly read what other people are reading and can dig deeply because of that. So that's all good stuff. But I love the totality of a book. I love that a woman or man has dug very deeply in a subject, has an arc to the story that they're trying to share with you, and it allows you to deep with greater curiosity. And so whether, by the way, some of the books that I read are audiobooks because I travel a great deal, but mostly I take them on airplanes with me. And I just love the experience. And all things being equal, if I had a choice between short form, quick hit stuff that can be emotive and not particularly substantive, or really get back and reflect, there's just no comparison.
One of the books that you recommend or you read this year is Umberto Eco's Serendipities, Language and Lunacy, one of my favorite writers. And you have a quote from Eco on your Books Read 2024 post. And this is what Eco writes. I'm not sure if he wrote it in Serendipities. By the age of 70, he who doesn't read will have lived only one life. He who reads will have lived 5,000 years. Reading is immortality backwards. Is that true, do you think, Chris?
Oh, I think it's utterly true. I mean, I had both my parents used to say that, and I had a sixth grade teacher who said, you just live thousands of lives by reading a book. You get to walk in other people's shoes and understand what's going on. It's a quote I certainly have said to my children over and over again. You have just a complete ability to reach other places and other periods and other thinking. It is like living many, many lives. And I can't imagine a world without books. I can't imagine why anyone would not want to have that as an integral part of the way they process the world we're in.
How do you choose your books? I mean, there are so many. You walk into a bookstore, you're often, it can be a little intimidating, the number of books. There aren't as many book reviews anymore. Do you tend to rely on friends' recommendations, or do you just go into bookstores and pick stuff up?
if you told me to read something, I'm going to read it. I have a litany of people who are just superb readers. And the act of them saying, this is worth your time, this is something that's very special in an area you care about, is certainly, probably half the books I read this year, certainly a third came that way. I will tell you, when I read very, very good books, I discover things. So I went last year to Vietnam for a month, and I did a great deal of preparation on the history as well as the current events aspects of it. And I learned about a guy whose book I talk about in my reading today, named Bernard Fall, who I'd not heard of previously, but I read about him in another Vietnam history book. Fall is one of the extraordinary figures of the 20th century. He had been a witness for the French at the Dien Bien Phu, which is arguably one of the most important battles of the century, and a great historian in his own right as well as a soldier. His story is unbelievable. I read a great biography of him, but his books about Vietnam were almost entirely prophetic, as well as great history. I never would have known that had I not read this other book that sort of alluded to him. So it becomes this virtuous cycle of a combination of people and then what you learn when you read themselves and they reference other books and so on.
Chris, do you think we should treat books like we treat people, in the sense that we give them a chance? Sometimes we meet people and we don't care for them. We may not give them a chance. I sometimes am perhaps a little impatient with books. If I've read the first few pages and it's boring, or in my view at least, it just doesn't get to what I'm interested in, I'll throw it away. Should we give books
I had a very
chances?
dear friend. I had a very dear friend who actually served in Iraq and Afghanistan, a very sensitive guy to time, very sensitive in it. And one day we were having beers together, and he sort of looked at me and he said, we were having a conversation, not unlike this. And he said, how many books do you read a year? And at that time, I think I was reading something like 50. And he said, okay, and what do the actuarial tables say you'll live? And that's a number. And he said, all right, multiply the two. And you multiply the two, and it's shockingly, whatever you read 10 books a year, 20 books a year, 100 books a year, 200 books a year, whatever it is a shocking small number when you see how many books you have in your life. And so what you learn is the discipline that leans really to what you just said, which is I probably get as far as 30 to 50 pages. But if it's not doing it for me, I call it, because the time I'm spending on a book which isn't working is time I could be reading another book in this very fixed amount of books that we have. And a lot of people, when I tell this story, think that that's kind of a depressing story. I don't think it's depressing at all. I think it's incredibly focusing. And bluntly, Andrew, I mean, I think about who I spend time with. I think about where I go in the world, because the time that I'm doing whatever that be, doing another version of it. And so it's been very inspiring to me. So I'm more your way now. I used to feel like I had to finish every book, and I will have no compunction by page 30 or so of saying it's just not the right fit, because God knows there's going to be a list far longer than I'll ever get to that is the right fit.
Maybe it's a warning to readers, not readers, writers, that they need to get into their books immediately, and not everyone will give them a second chance. It's perhaps true in terms of our personal meeting too. We're not going to have time, of course, Chris, to deal with all the books, but 3 came to mind when I was looking at the list, because they're all people who have been on the show talking about their books. Fukuyama's Liberalism in Its Discontents, Robert Kagan's The Ghost at the Feast, a wonderful history of American foreign policy in the first part of the 20th century, and Evan Thomas's Road to Surrender, a book about the American decision to drop nuclear weapons on Japan at the end of the Second World War. You don't need to talk about all 3, but of these 3, which particularly resonated with you?
They all resonate for different reasons overall. I mean, Fukuyama obviously gets often misquoted and misunderstood in terms of his initial very famous book back in 1989 or 1990 about the quote unquote the end of history. And he's much more circumspect than that. That book was more circumspect than that. And he did a very deep dive into how to think about where we are in the liberal order. And by the way, that does not mean a partisan liberal order, but liberal issues we find today. And the book does not become it's not a thing that you just would start putting on social media and sort of down to cliche. It really sort of unpacks what are the trade-offs in liberalism and what are the ways to think about it in effectiveness. I think one of the things that is missed in the conversation of politics and liberalism or not liberalism today is the idea that if governance is viewed as best as incompetent or as worst as a rigged game, you're going to have all sorts of people questioning the liberal order writ large. And one of the things that I appreciated in his book was really an understanding that governance has to deliver. Democracy has to deliver. It's not just a state of mind or a theoretical construct. And I think he sort of unpacked that with a lot of analogies and analysis that
And
I
I
thought was
thought
very
that
stimulating overall. I am
the
very interested.
Fukuyama book doesn't pull its punches either on what he sees, at least, as the consequence of identity politics on liberalism. I mean, he's a liberal, but a liberal on the right, perhaps, than on the left. But he's certainly concerned with the preoccupation with identity politics, particularly on the left, has had dire implications for liberalism in the 21st century.
I think it calls into question the purpose of government. I mean, it's interesting. I have a deep pride in many aspects of who I am and where I come from. I'm the grandson of immigrants. That stuff matters to me. But at the end of the day, they are not an almost red guard like language that I feel that I have to use to rationalize the way government should function or what I expect man or woman. It's just deeper than that. And I think you're right. I think you accurately. And in many respects, because you asked about the other books, I mean, the Kaplan book, I'm doing a lot of reading recently about Kagan book. I'm sorry, not Kaplan, but I've done a lot of reading about the sort of the build up to World War I and the build up to World War II. And you know, in many respects, history is a very clear cautionary note to the kinds of things that Frank talked about in his book as well. And then look, Evan Evans is just a beautiful writer, and I think he took a very serious and direct view and opened up with a lot of interesting, I think, new data about how complicated that decision was. And I think he came down net believing that it was the right thing to do in a very difficult series of circumstances with obviously terrible trade-offs.
Yeah, I have to admit, I wasn't, I can't say disappointed, that's the wrong word, and it's an unfair word. But I thought that Thomas might have been a little bit more critical of the decision. I mean, it's such a hard subject, I guess, to observe retrospectively. But I think I hadn't read the book, but certainly in the conversation, I mean, I perused the book. I thought that he may have given the Truman administration a bit of a free pass, but what do I know?
You know, it's interesting. Well, I mean, it's a fair pushback, and obviously, it's a very central historical debate since the day it was dropped, and certainly when Hersey wrote his first report of what he saw for the New Yorker, which is another wonderful book to reread about it. But I think at the end of the day, what he did, as I think he has a historian's gene in this, is he tried to not take 21st century views onto it, but to try to get into the heads of the women and men at that time and the access to information that they had and what it was like to be in a war where people were dying massively and where the premises were that literally a million more Americans could die. I think he really tried to get us into the head of the context of the time, and which of course led to the decision that was made.
The Kagan book is of course important. He also came out, I think, with a book after that, warning of the condition of American democracy. Do you think that this ghost at the feast is a real warning about American isolationism or potential isolationism?
I think it is, and I think the warning should be taken very seriously. I've never viewed the idea that America has a place in the world with synonymous with jingoism, and nor have I thought of it as something that was binary, that either you're in or you're out. I think that there's nothing wrong because every country should begin with the premise that you are engaging for your interests and should be unapologetic about it. But at the same time, you have to also be open to the idea that the world doesn't want to be told what to do all the time if you're one of the strongest players, as we were mostly after World War II. And I think that, frankly, what I hear a lot is, as you know, I travel all over the world regularly. I help entrepreneurs across emerging markets, but I actually look in Europe and other places now. I talk to a lot of people from a new generation thinking about the world, and they are building very exciting and competitive enterprises for their market's terms. And I think what I'm hearing over and over again from the world is, look, we have a long history with America. We would like our kids to go to university in America. We like Taylor Swift. But you know, you got to compete now. Like, you can't just tell us what to do because it's the Cold War, and you can't tell us what to do because you'll threaten us with sanctions if we don't do what you ask us to do. The best way for you to compete in a world that's changing so rapidly is to compete. If you have unbelievable customer service with great product that we can trust, that's price competitive, net, you'll win every time. But that's what you have to do. And I think sometimes in this debate about putting up tariffs and putting up walls and that kind of stuff is lost that the number one premise should be, what are we doing to unleash the greatest strengths and assets that we can bring to bear in a competitive world?
Yeah, you're not just an investor, an entrepreneur. You've also been involved in several Republican administrations. You're based in DC, so you know the political world inside out. Are you concerned in some ways, Chris, by the consensus in Washington on tariffs? I mean, Biden isn't MAGA, isn't Trumpian, but he nonetheless embraced a lot of Trump's ideas when it came to tariffs, particularly with China.
I think, and particularly with China, is a very important clause because it's what tariffs, when, and how implemented, and to what end. I think at the end of the day, I'm worried about conversation that lacks sort of nuance and dynamics on the ground, or that shuts down debate about how to think about it in terms of our interests and again, a mutual place in the world, a co-authorship with the world going forward. China is, as you know quite well, probably the only truly bipartisan issue, at least in Washington, D.C. right now. And with that has lost a tremendous amount of nuance. It doesn't mean don't be tough. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't stand up for things which you disagree with, but also respect that they will probably do the same. But also figure out whether there are ways to have mutual interests that are important not only for the country's interests, but also for where the world is today. I mean, we spent decades of a Cold War that often could have become a hot war, and yet we found ways of engaging with, having conversations with people. And so I think sometimes, and this goes back almost to your question about social media versus reading, when there's not time to reflect and there's only time to be petulant or make things very simple, which are not simple, you can run into a bunch of issues. I thought one of the most interesting things about the president-elect's discussion about tariffs recently, when he took the first big shot after he won the election, was throughout my life when politicians have talked about tariffs, they tend to tie them to trade. I'm going to put up a tariff because you're dumping, or I'm going to put tariffs up because you're stealing my IP or whatever. And certainly President-elect Trump has used that language repeatedly. But what was interesting in these tariffs was that effectively when he talked about them vis-a-vis Mexico, he really wasn't talking about trade at all. He was talking about migration and keeping the border whole. And even when he sort of started slapping China, he talked less about the trade issues of China and more about fentanyl. So you start saying to yourself, it's kind of interesting that people are piecing this stuff together, and we should not overreact or oversimplify. People are thinking about it. If literally this administration throws up 60% tariffs and calls it a day, you and I are going to be having a much different conversation. But I'd have no evidence that we're in the time zone of that yet.
Well, if we do, we'll have you back on the show. 3 books particular I know you enjoyed, which I have to admit I'm not familiar with. Going back to nuclear war, the Annie Jacobsen book. What is it about this book? And it's done very well. It's certainly someone I should get on the show too. What does Jacobsen write about nuclear war that perhaps wasn't relevant when Truman decided to drop the bomb on Hiroshima?
Well, I think there are a couple of elements, one sort of macro to which you're asking, and then one specific to which you're asking. I think one, I'm of the generation that really came of age with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the ascendancy of America, and there were nuclear deals, and there were going to be small wars, but they sort of felt last 30 years that nuclear war is almost an impossible scenario. People just don't talk about it anymore. In the heart of the Cold War, and even up through the 80s and 90s, early 90s, people would talk about nuclear weapons and proliferation. We still talk about proliferation now, but the idea of a nuclear war is just too jarring. It seems almost passé until all of a sudden you have a war in Ukraine and a guy like Putin starts talking about nuclear weapons in a new way. Then you start assessing people's arsenals. And then you start seeing that China is adamant to build as large of an arsenal as America before having discussions about it. Putin, of course, stops the START treaty. And we're worried about Iran and other places. And all of a sudden you think this is a very serious scenario, in fact, and that we should be asking big questions about it. And I think Annie Jacobsen did a phenomenal job of waking us up to the idea that complacency needed to end, but she did it in a brilliant way, which she contrived a scenario of a nuclear attack coming of all places, one rogue attack from North Korea. And then she went minute by minute. She interviewed pretty much every living Secretary of Defense, every living CIA director, people in intelligence from overseas. She talked to people on Congress. She really did the reporting of what the minute by minute would be like, how much time you have to react, what are the different pressures that they're reacting on, who goes where, when, how you notify things. You can't stop reading this book. Every page you want to follow up to what ends up being a catastrophic answer, but it all
Does it
resonates.
end well,
And
or
I
does
think
it
it's a very,
end
very important
with
book.
the destruction of the planet?
It's a,
Yeah, you
you want
don't
me
want
to
to give
kill
away the
kill
ending.
the ending for people? It's no, but I mean, I don't think there's any scenario that we should be thinking about this where it ends well, and this one does not end well. But it's how it ends and why it ends and what happens in the in between of it, and things that we should be understanding and preparing. She goes into incredible detail about the state of nuclear forces today and where they are. When the book was given, it was actually given to me from a former very senior person in the CIA, and he and I both agree that the idea of a scenario of North Korea launching seemed insane. And yet, when you read it, it makes a tremendous amount of sense. And then it goes from there. By the way, I'm told that Netflix, I think, or Amazon Prime has bought the rights to it. And I hope so, because more and more people need to be cognizant of it. It is not a happy read. You don't read this because you're going to be joyful at the end of it. You read it because it's important and it's extremely well rendered.
Yeah, for other reasons, I've been rereading about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Kennedy Khrushchev standoff. Another book that you pick, which I'd never heard of, which sounds fascinating: The Russian Understanding of War, Blurring the Lines Between War and Peace. Do the Russians, and this is by, I know he's a Swedish-based writer, Oscar Jonsson. Do the Russians, according to Jonsson, do they think differently of war and potentially even nuclear war than the Americans?
The brilliance of this book, and it's only about 200 pages, and it came to me. I've been spending. You'll note I'm the chairman of the German Marshall Fund, which is probably the top think tank that focuses on transatlantic relationship. But the transatlantic relationship is no longer a geographic construct of merely Europe and America, but it's how do we collectively think about the trade issues we've talked about? How do we think about China? How do we think about India? How do we? I hate the word, but it's a descriptor. How do you think about the global South? This is not just about America and Europe. And so, in that, and particularly with Sweden becoming a new member of NATO, I've spent a lot of time in Stockholm. And it's just riveting to hear the perspectives and research of folks who've been watching Russia greatly. What Oscar did well, he's a leading academic and fellow in think tanks there. Everyone, by the way, in the Stockholm Military and Security have read it. I know a lot of people in America in defense and the agency and elsewhere have read it, though I keep handing it out to people because I think it's so important. What Oscar does is he's really a reporter. It's not a polemic at all, but he tries to explain with great clarity, particularly Putin's view of where war is. And in many respects, if people really got into how Putin sees the world and how he thinks about war, in many ways, I think that we would have been much better at predicting how things have played out with Ukraine, both in the beginning and now. And I think one of the couple of things that he really gets into some sort of almost philosophical discussion about Clausewitz and the essence of war. And part of his argument is that the essence of war now comprises information war, that we need to understand that this is as much a part of war as any other element of it. And of course, violence in the end is what really determines a war is. But he quotes a Russian general, very interesting in the book, who said that when he became a soldier 25 years ago, whatever it was, war for him was about 80% violence and 20% propaganda. And he said, today, I think war is 80% propaganda and 20% violence. And, any general I've spoken to who's served in combat bristles a little bit out of it, but it is provocative. And the point that it's making is that information war, as we know, whether it's coming from China or people we don't know or Russians, is a part of us. It's actually touching all of us in framing the discussions that we are. It is a part of the essence of war. And in many respects, we're always at war as long as actors are using it. And I don't think enough people are willing to look at it as coldly and analytically as he does, and then put it in the mind of a guy like Putin and how he's using it. And the other thing, of course, he talks about is new technology and swarm war, things not only like cyber, but things like drones. And so it's a very wonderful placemat of how the Russians are thinking about how the essence of war is evolving and what its ramifications will be going forward. I think it's a very important read.
I'd forgotten the name of the person we had earlier when we were talking, but it was Mark Galeotti, another historian of Russian foreign policy.
Yeah.
He came on with a new book also about a history of Russian foreign policy and Russian sense of war. Does the Jonsson book, should it, if one reads it, should it make one more or less worried about Putin's occasional threats to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine if things don't go his way?
I don't. I don't think that it's utterly prescriptive in that way. I mean, it certainly will talk about a Putin back versus a Putin who's not, and frankly, it'll touch or not, as many figures in history have done. He will certainly use as a tool of propaganda at home that Russia's on its back heel and there are enemies trying to put us as a country and a culture into a box in a corner. And so there's all those elements of it. But again, the book is not really prophetic. It really is trying to get us into the head of Putin and his generals so that we walk in their shoes of how they're thinking about war today and its future and how they will use it. And that's one of the things I really respect about it.
And the final book that you mentioned that I hadn't heard of, which also sounds really good, is very different from Nuclear War and Russian Understanding of War, The Hamilton Scheme, an epic tale of money and power in the American founding. What do we learn from William Hoagland? There's so many books about Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson and the foundations of American democracy. What do we learn about this book, Chris, that we didn't already know?
Not only are there so many books about this stuff, and obviously Hamilton became a thing unto its own in the popular mind with the magnificent play and the movie and all that kind of stuff. And people either read Chernow's magisterial biography or said that they did. And I, when I was even back in university, I studied American Revolution and colonial history with Bernard Bailyn, who was one of the legends of the time. So I thought I had a pretty good handle of this. And almost every page of this book surprised me. And sort of the arc of it was to really unpack the importance of how Hamilton and other major business figures of the time, Robert Morris is one of the key figures here, who was literally the richest man in America at the time, was probably one of the richest men in the world. He had done it in all sorts of area of trade and taking advantage of the times. He helped fund Washington in many ways. He was almost like J.P. Morgan in terms of being sort of a funder of many people. But it wasn't just a story about greed. It was a story about the essence of what kind of country Hamilton and Morris and people like them wanted to have. And they very deeply felt that England was the model. They didn't want a king or anything like that, but they felt that a more central government meant more power, that a central bank meant more power, that if you really were able to bring together the financial elements and strengths and investment capacities of a country, you'd be able to invest and build all the things that a great nation would have to be, and that a nation of 13 colonies that was highly federated was never going to reach that kind of potential, would be problematic. And I had always thought about the debt crisis after the war, because as you'll remember, most of the colony, not only was there some federal debt, but there was a bunch of debt that each of the colonies had. And I always sort of thought that the debt was a burden and no one could figure out what to do with it. It was Hamilton's genius to sort of say, we'll figure out a way the federal government could take it on and sort of swallow the pain, pretty much because there was no choice. And what is very clear in this book is that Hamilton and Morris and many people around them knew from the beginning that the debt was a strategic asset to begin to unify the finances of the country, to put it on a place where it could become a great nation overall. And it's a long book, but it's a page turner, particularly in the early parts of it. And I knew almost none of it, even though I had read so much and had studied Hamilton and other figures at the time. It was marvelous.
You wrote a couple of interesting pieces on your Substack page on America, China, and a world of choice, and then something about resilience, opportunity, and risk in Taiwan. I know, wearing one of your other hats, you're an investor in startups around the world. What have you learned in your travels to China and Taiwan, Chris, that many Americans don't know?
It's a lens on China per se, but interestingly, it's a lens on other rising countries who very much are part of the China story. China looms large over all of them. And I can be in Saudi Arabia, I can be in Egypt, I can be in Brazil. And, China now is a leading trading partner in almost all cases, and they're offering very competitive sources of business. And I think a lot of times in America, in the business community, including Silicon Valley, there's a sort of feeling that this is a new Cold War and that we need to convince our allies to not choose China, but to choose us. And it's a little bit what I discussed before. In fact, I had fascinating conversations in Riyadh a couple of times around the time that I wrote this piece on China and the world of choice, but also it was on my mind a lot during my trip to Taiwan, is that people kept saying to me, he said, look, we really do like doing business with America. We have a history with America. It's always not always great, and sometimes it's bumpy. But at the end of the day, as I said before, we want to send our kids there. We want to have this kind of engagement. But you need to understand that China is competing in unbelievably powerful ways across the boards. So I got into a conversation with a fellow who runs one of the largest auto dealerships in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Gulf. And he said, they're developing $7,000 cars, which are really quite beautifully designed. I said, well, this is the EV story. Everyone talks about China sort of sucking up the market of EVs. And he said, no, these aren't EVs at all. These are small, really wonderful cars, traditional cars that regular people can afford. And I said, well, how good are they? And he smiled at me and he said, look, it's $7,000 a car. You can go through three of them, and it's still cheaper than any one American or Korean or Japanese car I normally sell. And now I've got to think about selling these, because the fact is you're not going to need three of them. They are going to be competitive, and they're going to go last. And I can't tell you, the customer service I get from the manufacturers is unbelievable. The pricing is 30% less of others. They really listen to us, and they really make us want to think about being partners with us. And I think it's just a reminder that while maybe there's some comfort in all things being equal, people would rather do business with AWS than, say, Ali Cloud or whatever. I'm not sure that's a presumption that we can really keep. That at the end of the day, everyone knows that every company you do business with, there's going to be some risk involved in it. And if you have wonderful customer service, someone wants to partner with you for a long time and is willing to do this wonderful service and deliver excellent product at 30% less than the market, you can't ignore that. And I think too often we think, well, everyone knows that China will change the rules of the game in 3 years. And certainly that's in the calculus. But people realize at the end of the day that that's not always happening the way that I think a lot of Americans assume that they do. I think a lot of Americans assume that they will not want to do partnerships in technology. And I get these almost crazy looks from people all across rising markets who say, well, why wouldn't we do business with them? I mean, Saudi Arabia is considering building nuclear reactor for the first time, and it has a plan to do multiple of them. It's very early stages, but China will bid, and it'll be taken very seriously. Our assumption that it won't, if we do not have competitive product, is an assumption which I think we need to be very careful of. And it's not just about China. Any market that we go into now, there are really amazing and interesting products being built by locals on locals' the desires and needs. And we can sort of poo-poo it and say, well, at the end of the day, everyone wants the American brand. Or we can say to ourselves, the best way to compete is to compete. And I think it's a wake-up call that I hope this new administration is thinking about, so that we don't just get tied to trying to recreate some sort of dynamic where choose between us and the rest of the world, but to say that we're unleashing everything we can to be as competitive we can wherever that competition may come. The best way to compete is not by sort of just slapping other people around or telling people to get on side. It's literally by having the best product and service at the best price.
Lots of books, Chris, you've chosen in your list on war. You have this post on Taiwan.
Yeah,
Risk in Taiwan. I know you're a big admirer of Chris Miller's work on chips.
I am.
He wrote a whole prize-winning book about the chip industry in Taiwan. How worried are you in your travels around the world, particularly in East Asia, about the risk of war in Taiwan?
I'm worried. Look, I'm a very hopeful man by nature. I spend most of my time with young builders around the world, certainly plenty in Silicon Valley, and we don't talk enough about what's hopeful today because of the thing that does cause me worry, which is we're living in this era where, for all intents and purposes, all bets are on the table. I mean, most of the bumpers in the world that you and I were raised with are being tested in many, many surprising ways. We would not have predicted 10 years ago that Russia would invade Ukraine the way that they did and how they did it. Russia certainly would not have expected Europe to unify the way that he did around it. I think that people were not merely asleep at the switch because all of a sudden Europe allowed 90% of their energy needs to be supplied by Russia. I think there was a presumption that the world was opening up in a new way where we could take advantage of these competitive attributes. And certainly China was another example of it. And you see China testing in many ways that we did not necessarily predict before. I would make an argument that things that Bibi has been doing in the whole Levant are things that are testing bumpers that would have been total red lines 10 years ago if we had the conversation about that. And so we're in this world where people are testing all over. Things are happening bottom up that there isn't a lot of focus on how to think about it differently than we did before. And I was just talking to a friend of mine who was telling me at times like this, when everything's on the table and the big powers are doing the big thing, and media may put a little bit of attention on that, they're missing a whole bunch of small actors doing stuff. And there's a lot of real crisis happening, for example, like places like Kuwait, where the leadership is now literally hoping to take 25 or 30% of its citizens not no longer to be citizens anymore. If you're married to a Kuwaiti, there may be some question about whether or not you can keep your Kuwaiti citizenship. And there's just so many people that are testing the system writ large. And with that, you are swimming in an ocean of black swans. And despite my hopefulness, despite my belief that young people are building and doing solutions which are incredibly powerful bottom up, the top down matters profoundly. And we're in a world where the top down is testing in many, many different ways. And as I say, that's a sea of black swans, and we're just going to have to be very, very wise and smart, and hopefully not overly emotive.
Yeah, I got the title
in
now for
acknowledging
this
what happened.
conversation, Swimming in an Ocean of Black Swans. You sort of slightly sidestepped the question of war in Taiwan. But
well, it's a case study, but let's hit it just for 2 seconds overall. I mean, a lot of the experts, people know far more about Taiwan than I ever do, have a host of reasons. Well, now is not the time, but it goes back, I think, in many respects to Oscar Jonson's book. If you think the way I think, there's no scenario where China is going into Taiwan anytime soon. But the way I think is not necessarily the way she thinks, and not necessarily the context of what they understand. And I think part of our job is to say, look, there's a lot of testing going on that is very disruptive. When I was in Taiwan, the number one word that was being talked about in both parties, and both parties do not agree on a lot, and there's a lot of political tension there, but the word resilience was there. They are all aware that there are things happening that are getting very, very aggressive and problematic. And also, by the way, we should not keep our eyes off of the Philippines. And so it's a key black swan that I think we need to be very cautious about and very concerned about. That's not a prediction to say that something will happen in a year. I don't have the wherewithal to do that. I mean, Xi has certainly said that in 2027 he wants to be prepared to do so should he want to. I hope that there'll be a bunch of reasons to sort of keep that in bay, and that there will be different scenarios for that. But again, when we're in a world where people are testing, we have to ask ourselves, with the way America is spread so thin, the way the rest of the world is distracted with so many things, Germany with its elections, France with its elections, the Middle East now, and Turkey, what's happening with Syria, who's gonna stop militarily China from becoming more aggressive? And if you look at that question cold and analytically, you have to think twice about what the scenarios may look like.
yeah, I like your use of the word testing. Of course, I don't want to have another Trump conversation, but his comments on Greenland and elsewhere are also his way. I mean, he's a tester. His whole life has been one long test, pushing the boundaries, seeing what he can get away with and what he can't. So certainly that's going to be a theme. Finally, you mentioned that you are, one of the other things you do is you chair the German Marshall Fund. I'm not quite sure how you have time for that and all your investing and all the books, but you managed to do it. Maybe you have an AI somewhere. You're running an interesting series of conversations on the German Marshall Fund website on the impact of AI on the world. And you interview, I know, two of your friends, Mark Andreessen and Reid Hoffman, who I don't suppose they spend a lot of time together. Hoffman, of course, is perhaps the most prominent Silicon Valley Democrat, or certainly funder of Democrats, and Mark Andreessen has become more and more outspoken in his support of Trump. I wonder, Chris, whether you've been, and you sit or stand in an interesting place. You're a DC-based guy, both in business and in politics, but you also have very strong connections with Silicon Valley. Have you been surprised with the overtness of Andreessen and Musk's support for Trump, and indeed for Hoffman's overt support for Harris in the election? In other words, have you been surprised with the way in which the powerful of Silicon Valley have become, whether they've been dragged or dragged themselves into the mainstream of American politics? This hasn't always been a feature of Silicon Valley.
No, or a business writ large overall. Look, I just think it is a reflection of our times, and it's a reflection of this sort of elbowing that we see happening around the world, and even within our own country. And therefore, people who have not only a significant stake in our country, but frankly have extremely strong conviction that this is an extraordinary country and that we want to do certain things to be able to unleash that excellence, is not only not surprising, but in some respects, I think is overlooked. I think that a lot of people like to make these figures into caricatures rather than to really unpack that at their essence, they are articulating a view of where America should be at this time in the world. And the fact is, when you have people who are very smart, you're going to have people who come at it with very different premises and different looks at it. And the beauty of our country is that people ought to be able to get into that discussion and hit it with everything that they have. The problem is we are living in times when what happens is it becomes very personal and people start to attack each other, and then it becomes noise and ego and not necessarily about the substance of the arguments that they're making. So I think if you asked me this question 10 years ago, I would have been surprised, and quite bluntly, that not the people that you've mentioned, but there are other friends in Silicon Valley and in the business world generally who sometimes think that what they say on social media is actually people care. And I just try to caution them. I'm like, are you adding gasoline to a fire of no nuance and a fire of not able to have a serious discussion? Or do you feel you're actually, not only taking a stand in a view that you very reasonably have, but at the same time actually helps the conversation become better? But this was a very, very distinct election with very distinct views. And, I think that it's not surprising that we had people came at it very aggressively and put everything they could to it. But I think that it often gets trivialized as people are doing this for economic gain or they're doing it for their ego or what have you. And it's my view that there's a tremendous debate about what it means for America to compete in the world that we've been describing most of this discussion. And it shouldn't be underestimated that it comes from a very genuine place where people feel very, very strongly if we don't get it right now, we may never get it right. You look at $30 trillion in debt, you look at what we've just come out of in terms of inflation and other areas, and a lot of sort of divisive conversation where Americans are taking each other apart because we don't use the right language with each other and everyone offends everybody, whatever all. I must tell you personally, and this is not me talking as a GMF, this is not me talking for Next Billion Ventures or anything I'm affiliated with, this is me talking as Chris Schroeder. I think that we have sort of lost our way in ability to really focus on what does it take to unleash the best of what we have and to do it responsibly and co-authoredly with people who are allies in the world. This is a moment for us to rise into that. And I think we lost our way. We started to get constricted into a series of issues that are not unimportant, but they often were not the central issues of what we need to be able to address the reality of the world.
And finally, these conversations you've been running on the German Marshall Fund are on transatlantic AI. Reid Hoffman and Mark Andreessen agree about much politically, but they're both very smart investors and entrepreneurs. Are they pretty much, and you've had some other interesting people on the show, including some European entrepreneurs. Are Hoffman and Andreessen on the same page when it comes to the impact of AI on the world of the 2020s?
I don't want to speak, for them in
you interviewed them and you're friendly with them both.
Yes, and I interviewed Chris Miller on this, and we had fascinating politicians of the EU who really, part of the goal of the series was to get people to step back and to breathe and to not sort of viscerally react that all of a sudden Europe has come up with a series of regulations that were sort of based on their previous data regulations. And it's not unlike everything we've been talking about in this conversation. Can we get people to step back and listen to the folks who are building this, the ones who are regulating this, folks who are affected by this? We have people from national security, who talked about this in various ways, so that people could sort of get a map on what are the things that are happening with AI now, and to also bring into question, and in this way, virtually everyone that we interviewed was uniform in this, which is to say we tend to look at new technology and want to figure out the regulation of its problems. And we need to have a serious, serious conversation about the potential it's unleashing as well. And no one we talked to, even the most sort of positive about the ramifications here, were sort of Panglossian about it. They were very, very direct that every new technology will bring things that we need to watch and have discussion about, in some cases, unarguably regulate. But they really were trying to all wake us up to where the status of things are, where are the central issues about it, and where does the opportunity lie. And I can tell you that in my dealing in the intersection of business policy and technology, where I spend a lot of my time in that, both here and abroad, often it gravitates to all the problems and the fears and the language that fits very well on Twitter, but isn't really getting to the essence of what we need to think about. And these discussions, and I really salute Karen Kornblue, and right now we have an acting president who really has supported this, and Alexander Schaefer. Like this is a great thing to just get people to breathe, and then we can decide what to do.
And finally, the most unfair question, Chris, I have to ask you, is your favorite book from 2024? Is there one?
Really, I wrote in the blog about 10 or 15 that were sort of up there.
But if there's one,
they're all
that you would suggest everyone has to read.
I'm going to cheat on your question, give two. If you told me there's one book you have to read to sort of have a sense of where the world is going right now, I probably would choose Johnson's book on Russia, because I just think it opens up conversations about China and the rest of the world. And I will tell you that one of my favorite readers, a young man, gave me But do you see me?
Yeah, I see you.
Yeah.
So you just had that final thing to say. You said a young man. So you were going to talk about your second book.
He got me reading Steinbeck, and I will tell you, just as a use of language, a precision of language, I loved everything that I read there. And so I think there's some beautiful books there that are worth looking at. And I don't get enough fiction, and I have a lot of friends who think fiction is kind of a waste of time, but I actually think it really allows one to walk in somebody else's shoes and really get into it. I read East of Eden, and I couldn't put it down.
Well, Chris Schroeder, the chair of the German Marshall Fund, the head of an investment firm, a blogger, reader, real honor to talk as always. I hope it won't be this time next year. We will talk again. I hope we'll have a chance during 2025. But I wish you all the best on all your travels and all your reading, and we'll talk again in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you, Andrew.